September 19, 1939, marked a critical juncture in the early weeks of World War II, as the combined German and Soviet invasions of Poland continued unabated. With Warsaw under relentless siege by German forces and Soviet troops advancing steadily from the east, the fate of Poland seemed increasingly sealed. The actions of this day underscored the rapid collapse of Polish resistance, the strategic maneuvers of the Axis and Soviet powers, and the growing sense of urgency among the Allied nations. Meanwhile, the global community watched closely as the implications of these developments began to ripple across Europe and beyond. The Siege of Warsaw, a city on the brink of capitulation. By September 19th, Warsaw was on the brink of collapse. The German Wehrmacht, having completed the encirclement of the Polish capital, intensified its bombardment to break the will of the defenders. The Luftwaffe maintained a punishing campaign of aerial bombardment, targeting both military and civilian infrastructure in a final push to force the city's surrender. The city, already in ruins, faced a grim future as food, water, and medical supplies dwindled to critical levels. Inside Warsaw, the situation grew increasingly desperate. The Polish defenders, comprising regular army units, local militias, and thousands of civilian volunteers, continued to resist, but the prospects of holding out against the German onslaught were bleak. Under the leadership of General Walerian Chuma and Mayor Stefan Starzyński, efforts were made to sustain morale and maintain a semblance of order. However, the constant shelling and air raids took a heavy toll on the city's infrastructure and its people. The humanitarian crisis deepened, with hospitals overwhelmed and basic necessities in short supply. On September 19th, Warsaw's defenders faced a stark choice: continue to resist in the hope of delaying the inevitable, or surrender to spare the city further destruction and loss of life. Despite the dire circumstances, the spirit of defiance among Warsaw's residents remained strong. Mayor Starzyński continued his daily radio broadcasts, urging the population to stand firm and resist the invaders to the last. Yet, with German forces tightening their grip and no prospect of relief from the outside, the situation appeared increasingly hopeless. Soviet advances, consolidating control in eastern Poland. While Warsaw struggled under German siege, the Soviet Red Army moved swiftly to consolidate control over eastern Poland. Following their invasion on September 17th, Soviet forces encountered minimal organized resistance, as the Polish military was already heavily engaged in the west against the Germans. The rapid Soviet advance was characterized by the systematic occupation of key towns and cities, disarming Polish units, and establishing Soviet authority. On September 19th, the Red Army continued its occupation efforts, moving deeper into Polish territory and securing strategic locations. The Soviet administration wasted no time in implementing measures to integrate these regions into the Soviet state. Local government structures were dismantled, and Soviet officials took control of administrative functions. The nationalization of industry and the collectivization of agriculture began almost immediately, reflecting the Soviet Union's broader ideological goals and its desire to secure its newly acquired territories. The Soviet occupation was marked by a wave of repression aimed at eliminating potential resistance and consolidating control. Thousands of Polish military officers, civil servants, and intellectuals were arrested and deported to labor camps in Siberia and other remote areas of the Soviet Union. For many Poles in the eastern regions, the Soviet occupation brought a new form of oppression, characterized by political purges, forced relocations, and the imposition of Soviet ideology. The swift and brutal actions of the Soviet occupiers made it clear that eastern Poland was now firmly under Moscow's control. German occupation, securing the Western Front. In the west, the German Wehrmacht continued its efforts to secure the areas under its occupation. Following the rapid defeat of Polish forces, German troops moved to establish administrative control over their designated zones, disarming remaining Polish military units and rounding up potential resistance leaders. The occupation was characterized by harsh measures aimed at asserting German authority and preventing any form of organized resistance. On September 19th, German forces began implementing policies designed to consolidate their control over occupied Poland. This included the imposition of curfews, the establishment of military checkpoints, and the rounding up of Polish intellectuals, military officers, and political leaders. The German occupation authorities sought to crush any potential resistance through a combination of intimidation, coercion, and targeted violence. The aim was to transform the occupied territories into a secure base for further military operations and to integrate them into the Greater German Reich. German propaganda continued to portray the invasion of Poland as a justified and defensive action, emphasizing the successes of the Wehrmacht and the necessity of securing Germany's eastern borders. This narrative was designed to maintain domestic support for the war effort and to justify the harsh measures being implemented in the occupied territories. For the Polish population, the German occupation represented a period of intense repression, marked by forced labor, arbitrary arrests, and executions. The Allied dilemma: increasing pressure and strategic reassessment. As Poland's fate became increasingly clear, the Allied powers, particularly the United Kingdom and France, faced mounting pressure to respond more decisively. The fall of Warsaw and the rapid Soviet advance into eastern Poland left the Allies grappling with a new reality: the complete occupation of their Eastern European ally by two hostile powers. The strategic implications of this development were profound, forcing the Allies to reassess their military and diplomatic strategies in light of the rapidly changing situation. In the United Kingdom, Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain's government was under growing scrutiny for its perceived failure to act decisively in defense of Poland. Public opinion was increasingly critical of the government's handling of the crisis, with many feeling that Britain had not done enough to support its Polish ally. On September 19th, the British War Cabinet continued to debate potential responses, including the possibility of increasing military aid to other potential victims of Axis aggression and expanding the scope of economic sanctions against both Germany and the Soviet Union. However, logistical challenges and concerns about military readiness continued to hamper the British response. The Royal Air Force (RAF) remained focused on defensive preparations, while the Royal Navy maintained its blockade of Germany in an effort to weaken the Nazi war machine through economic attrition. The British government also began to consider ways to support Polish forces that had escaped to France and other countries, recognizing the need to keep the Polish cause alive in the face of occupation. In France, the government of Prime Minister Édouard Daladier faced similar challenges. The French military, heavily focused on defending the Maginot Line and preparing for a potential German offensive in the west, was not in a position to intervene directly in Poland. The French public, like their British counterparts, was increasingly frustrated with the government's perceived inaction. The complete occupation of Poland forced France to reassess its strategic priorities and how best to support the Allied cause in an increasingly hostile environment. The failure of the Allies to provide more substantial support to Poland highlighted broader strategic dilemmas. Both the British and French governments were wary of provoking a broader conflict before they were fully prepared, but this cautious approach also meant that Poland had been left to face the German and Soviet onslaught largely alone. The events of September 19th underscored the limitations of the Allied military and diplomatic strategies and the need for a more coordinated and decisive approach to countering the Axis and Soviet threats. International reactions, diplomatic maneuvers, and global realignments. The continued occupation of Poland by German and Soviet forces and the impending fall of Warsaw prompted strong reactions from the international community. Many nations began to reassess their positions and strategies in response to the rapidly changing landscape of the war. In the United States, President Franklin D. Roosevelt maintained a stance of neutrality but was increasingly aware of the potential implications of the conflict for global stability. On September 19th, discussions within the U.S. government continued to focus on expanding support to the Allies, including economic and material aid through measures like the cash-and-carry policy. This policy, allowing belligerents to purchase arms from the U.S. provided they transported the goods themselves, gained further support as a means of aiding Britain and France while maintaining American neutrality. In Italy, Benito Mussolini's regime continued to advocate for a negotiated peace, positioning Italy as a potential mediator in the conflict. On September 19th, Mussolini reiterated his proposal for an international conference to resolve the war, seeking to bolster Italy's diplomatic standing while avoiding direct involvement in the conflict. However, this offer was largely dismissed by the Western Allies, who viewed it as an attempt to weaken their resolve and buy time for the Axis powers. Other neutral nations, such as Switzerland, Sweden, and the Netherlands, continued to bolster their defenses and prepare for potential spillover from the conflict. These countries, aware of their strategic positions and vulnerabilities, sought to maintain their neutrality while preparing for potential threats from both the Axis and Allied powers. The situation was particularly tense in Belgium and the Netherlands, where fears of German invasion prompted increased military readiness and diplomatic efforts to secure guarantees of neutrality. Media coverage and global public opinion. On September 19th, media coverage around the world continued to focus on the dramatic events unfolding in Poland and the broader strategic implications of the war. Newspapers, radio broadcasts, and newsreels provided updates on the military situation and the responses of the belligerent nations, shaping public perceptions and understanding of the conflict. In the United Kingdom, the BBC and major newspapers like The Times and The Daily Telegraph reported on the imminent fall of Warsaw and the continued advance of Soviet forces in eastern Poland with a sense of urgency and condemnation. Coverage emphasized the plight of the Polish people and the need for a more robust Allied response. Editorials called for increased support for other potential victims of Axis aggression and debated the merits of launching an offensive against Germany versus continuing a more cautious approach. In France, newspapers such as Le Figaro and Le Monde highlighted the humanitarian crisis in Warsaw and the broader implications of the Soviet and German occupations. The French press reflected the public's growing anxiety and frustration with the government's perceived lack of decisive action. Opinion pieces called for greater coordination with the British and a more aggressive stance to support Poland, while others warned of the risks of escalating the conflict without adequate preparation. In Germany, state-controlled media continued to portray the invasion of Poland as a necessary and justified action, emphasizing the successes of the Wehrmacht and the righteousness of Germany's actions. Propaganda outlets like Völkischer Beobachter and Der Angriff highlighted the military victories and portrayed the campaign as a defensive struggle against foreign aggression. The propaganda aimed to maintain public morale and support for the war effort, even as the realities of a prolonged conflict began to take shape. In the Soviet Union, state media maintained a narrative of neutrality and defense, presenting the invasion as a necessary step to protect ethnic minorities and restore order in Eastern Europe. Soviet newspapers and radio broadcasts portrayed the Red Army as liberators, bringing stability and protection to the peoples of the eastern regions of Poland. This narrative was designed to justify the Soviet actions both domestically and internationally, framing the intervention as a necessary step to prevent further chaos and bloodshed. Strategic implications and the road ahead. The events of September 19, 1939, underscored the rapidly changing dynamics of the conflict and the strategic dilemmas faced by all parties involved. For Poland, the day marked a further descent into occupation and repression, as the fall of Warsaw seemed imminent and the country was effectively divided between two totalitarian powers. The Allied powers faced a complex set of challenges as they grappled with how best to respond to the dual threats of Nazi Germany and Soviet expansionism. For the United Kingdom and France, the day highlighted the difficulties of coalition warfare and the challenges of transitioning from peace to war. Both nations were still adjusting to the realities of a conflict they had hoped to avoid and were faced with strategic uncertainties regarding how best to respond to the expanding scope of the war. The debates over offensive versus defensive strategies, and the extent to which they could and should support other nations threatened by Axis aggression, reflected broader tensions within the Allied leadership that would continue to shape the early phases of the war. Internationally, the continued advance of German and Soviet forces into Poland prompted further reassessments and strategic recalibrations. The United States maintained its official stance of neutrality but was increasingly aware of the potential global implications of the conflict. Italy and other nations watched closely, each calculating how best to navigate the rapidly shifting geopolitical landscape to their advantage. Conclusion: a war deepening and global stakes rising. September 19, 1939, was a day of profound significance, as the continued siege of Warsaw and the consolidation of Soviet control over eastern Poland highlighted the brutal realities of the Second World War.